Rob, welcome back to the show. And this time round, we get to go even more in depth in your story.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. It's great to be here, and yeah, looking forward to speaking.
And I feel one of my skills as a podcaster over the last few years has been really heavily preparing for interviewing my guests. And when I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed you, probably about 12 months ago, like March 2023, I really felt like I knew you. But
Mm-hmm.
honestly, having read your book, the depth that I now understand your backstory and also some of the depth to some of the phrases or parts of your story that I learned about, I now feel like all the dots have been joined, and I really understand the origin story of Rob Henderson and how he came to end up in the position he's in.
Yeah, that was something I struggled a lot with because, I've written essays and posts and spoken publicly for the last few years about my unusual trajectory into higher education and then building a public platform and through my writing and through some of my ideas. But it was always difficult because I didn't want to divulge everything, because I was working on this book and I wanted the book to be the kind of comprehensive um, explanation, because people would always ask, like, how did you go from foster care to military to Yale, and like, how does that work? And I answered the questions in an honest way, but there's only so much time you can spend, in a sort of face-to-face, person-to-person discussion going through the details. But when you have a book, you can go through sort of each layer, each individual encounter, different stories, pivotal moments. And it was nice. It's nice now to finally just have it all out there. And if people have questions about specific events or details, I can speak freely about it without worrying about giving everything away before the book comes out.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think, as you say, I would describe you as very much an open book previous to this, but this is genuinely like so in depth. And like one of the stats that I had the last time I interviewed you was like, oh, like 10 different foster homes. But when
Mhm.
you actually read your story, you understand what 10 different foster homes actually means in terms of being torn away from an environment so regularly, really struggling to build that attachment or being allowed to build that attachment, both with the other kids, but also the foster parents. And I think it's easy to get lost in like headlines like, oh, I was in 10 different foster homes. But when you actually understand what that means, it's so much deeper than just the initial stat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we can understand on a kind of superficial, intellectual level. We can hear something and, oh, that sounds tough. But like anything else, once you actually sort of read someone's firsthand experience or, get the sort of secondhand um, details and, that sort of immersive experience, that it's a lot different than just sort of hearing something offhand. It's sort of like, that you hear someone runs a marathon and then you read about someone who actually trains for it and then does it, and then you actually do it yourself, and there's a different sort of layers into, as far as like what you actually learn for what it means to do something or go through something that's very demanding and difficult.
I think there's a reason that people build greater connection with someone they've read their book or they've listened to them on a lot of podcasts or YouTube content or something like that. Because the whole phrase in my head from my sales background is facts tell, stories sell. And I really feel
Mm.
that somebody would use a fact like 10 different foster homes, but the actual stories behind that are so much deeper and so much more valuable to actually understand what that process looked like and how it formed some of the behaviors that you exhibited throughout your teens and then even beyond that as well.
Yeah, well, that was a struggle that I had when I first started writing the book. I wondered what it was actually going to be. At first I did want it to be more facts driven, more data driven, more sociological and psychological. And, I thought, okay, I'll bring in some research, some studies, some survey data, and then maybe I'll intersperse it with some stories, some examples from my own life. And, as I started writing and as I spoke with other authors and memoirists and people who, had been in the book publishing world and people who are storytellers, I realized that, if you really want to get the point across, it's better to do it the other way, where you focus more on the personal story and then, bring in some data and some research and some studies to back up some of the claims. And so, that was like, how do I balance this? I basically bookended it where the preface is very data driven. I cite a lot of research and psychological concepts and frameworks. And that's how I start the book. And then chapter one, we just sort of dive right into firsthand personal narrative. And then towards the end of the book, again, I bring in some more sort of sociological observations and class analysis and kind of conclude the book with more research and studies and so on, so that, there's something for everyone. If you really just want to learn about the facts and the sort of aggregate data, you can read, the first, like the preface and like maybe the last two or three chapters. But if you really just want to dive into the story, just start from chapter one and go from there, and you'll sort of see where I'm coming from and why these ideas are important to me.
You struck the balance so well. And even when you say the preface was data led, one of the things that you wrote was quite an emotional reflection. And it was, I've heard the variations of the phrase, I'm grateful for what I went through because it made me who I am today. And despite you being proud of what you've accomplished, you strongly disagree with that statement. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, and it's a common line that people will resort to, that, people, especially people who've had tough lives, that everything I went through made me who I am today, and I'm so grateful, even if it was hard at the time, and so on. And I think that is a useful, and it's a functional story that we can tell ourselves. And it's common for resilient people to tell themselves that story. Especially, it's probably better than not having that story, because there was a long time where I believed it, and some days I believe in it more than others. But broadly, I have taken a more skeptical stance. I think that when people accomplish great things, or defy expectations, or do just sort of do things that are more than what you might have expected, it's in spite of those early life struggles and not because of
You were an
them.
outlier.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't, I had this conversation with a friend of mine the other day that, he and I were speaking about this, and you can kind of tell that it is a bit of a, kind of a form of self deception, because no one would wish this on anyone else. No one would wish their loved ones, or maybe even your enemies, to go through some of these early life experiences that I went through, that a lot of my friends went through, that a lot of kids today still go through. This friend of mine, he was telling me about how, he's very accomplished. He's an accomplished musician, really smart guy. And he told me, his mom had died when he was 18. And he would tell himself this story about how, the fact that my mom died when I was so young propelled me to, it made me more resilient, more ambitious. It contributed to my success at a young age. But then, as we were speaking, he's like, that was a story I told myself. And, he had read my book, and he was telling me, as a way of explaining how he understood my point, he said he would give up all of his accomplishments to have his mom back. Um, and that's similar to a point that I make in the book, that, despite the things that I've done in my life, in my adult life, I would trade it all to have had a sort of more stable, normal upbringing without all of those stressful early life situations.
I really appreciate that level of reflection. And as you say, the story you tell yourself when you're going through the hard moments, I'm not saying it's a sense of self delusion, but it's sometimes important to like tell the story that helps you get to the best possible end
Right.
result. And that's clearly what you've done. But now that
Mhm.
you're at the point you're at, it is helpful to reflect in that way and be so clear that, yeah, I would have loved a stable family life. And I think based on the characteristics you exhibited, even under challenge, probably means that in a stable environment, as we will probably get into statistics on, you would have gone on to achieve great things because of your what you've gone on to do anyway, and it maybe would have happened in a less tumultuous environment too.
Yeah, yeah, and this, I mean, we're so focused in American society, Western society, on sort of individual accomplishment. You as an individual, what are you accomplishing? Are you, getting educated? Are you earning money? Are you, working in an occupational, an occupation that's prestigious and interesting and cool and high status? And um, we're focused so much on what happens after the age of 18, and not nearly enough on what happens before, especially for kids who grow up poor, working class, in deprived and dysfunctional circumstances. I've been mentoring this kid who just got into Harvard, and he was telling me, he was raised by a single mom, and he had a lot of early life difficulties. And, he was one of these kids who kind of defied the odds. And, he never knew his dad, and he told me that he would trade his admissions letter to Harvard if he could only just know who his dad was and have had a relationship with him. And so we're so, oh, how good for him that he went to, he got into this nice school, and he's probably going to be on paper a very successful guy. But what we don't see on paper, what we don't see on the resume or the LinkedIn page or on social media is, how hard it was for him and his mom, and being poor and being neglected and all those kinds of things. And so I'm hoping to sort of surface those concerns and sort of help people to reconsider their priorities.
I think you've done that. I look at the conversations off the back of the book, and I look at the reviews that you've had from like some really admirable individuals who I know we've both looked up to over the years, and for you to be rubbing shoulders with them is very well deserved in my opinion. And I agree that the family structure and family dynamics discussion is something that I'm sure we'll get onto luxury beliefs, which is what we discussed last time round. That is something that the elites have kind of pushed to the back burner. And yet, if
Mm,
you look at the outcomes that we're seeing, and you're talking about this young man that you're mentoring getting into Harvard, you getting into Yale, these were by their very nature outliers because you
mhm,
came from a background where you didn't have stability, you didn't have the level of support that a nuclear family has. And if we want to see more people achieve things in life and have that stability, then we should probably look to address something, as you say, that 0 to 18, where if you put somebody in the best possible environment, you give them the maximum opportunity to achieve these great things and move society in the direction that we all want it to go.
yeah. Well, if social mobility is our goal, it's useful to look at the data and what predicts upward social mobility. And the strongest predictor of whether a child goes on to graduate from university is being raised by two married parents. Like, that's by far the strongest predictor, more than income or money or anything else. Um, and even when you control for the education levels of the parents. So, for example, like if you look at college educated mothers, a married college educated mother, her child is twice as likely to graduate from college than an unmarried college educated mother. And so, even if
Wow.
the education levels are the same, whether you're married or not does make a difference for your own child. And and it's even more true for less educated mothers. So a woman whose highest level of education is high school. If she's married, her child is 3 times more likely to graduate from university than an unmarried high school educated mother. And so, these things matter sort of all across the sort of educational spectrum. And so I highlight that in the book that, okay, family stability, if your aim is social mobility, we should focus on family stability. But I also focus on this point that, education is it's a red herring. It's sort of a misguided aim. The people who set family policy and education policy and sort of the tastemakers in the culture, by and large, these are people who themselves have done very well in school, and they all were raised in intact families. Not all, but like 90% plus of them were raised in intact families, and it's something they don't really think about. I have this line in the book that I've met a lot of upper class people, in the American context, who have attempted to imagine what it would be like to be poor. They've tried to place themselves mentally in the shoes of someone who grew up without money, who lived in poverty. But I've never met anyone who grew up in an affluent context who's tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up without their family. And so my point is that family instability isn't bad because the kids are less likely to go to college or they're less likely to earn a lot of money. It's bad because the kids who live in those contexts they feel neglected, deprived, unnoticed, overlooked. They feel anxiety and sadness, and then they have these behavioral expressions of that pain through substance abuse and acting out and violence and all these other ways that they find to cope in an environment where there isn't a lot of adult oversight, and they have a single parent who might be working full time or is distracted or has their own commitments and obligations and distractions. So it's we focus so much on like what's the purpose of this, that, and the other, and in terms of measurable outcomes in terms of, income is something you can easily measure, educational attainment is something you can easily measure. It's very difficult to measure childhood well-being, and it's not something that we think a lot about. But just because we can't measure doesn't mean it's unimportant.
And
Um,
it's something that we see come
mhm,
to fruition downstream.
mhm.
So, for example,
Oh yeah,
of course, we can measure academic attainment and employment, as you say. But if we look at perhaps the mental health crisis that we're seeing, both female and in particular male, which I speak more to my audience about, can we link it back to the fact that many of these people come from broken homes? Potentially,
I,
like we could
I think
extrapolate that out,
so.
and that's not to say that it's always a reach. But I saw in the data that you shared that actually young men in fatherless homes had worse, and we're using education as a measurement, but worse educational outcomes than young women who come from fatherless homes. And I found that a fascinating insight as well.
Yeah, it seems like, it's so funny because I think in the popular imagination, um, we do have this like lingering stereotype that boys and men are strong and resilient or something. And physically, I mean, I think like, so physically, it's undeniable, especially after puberty, that there is a difference in terms of raw physical strength and formidability. But I think there's also this belief we sort of over extend that view to things like emotional resilience or ability to withstand early life adversity. And it actually doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like girls are actually more resilient in that sense, at least again in terms of sort of measurable outcomes, in terms of educational attainment, likelihood of employment, incarceration, falling off and living on the margins of society, that girls who are raised by single parents, single moms, are far more likely to graduate from high school, graduate from college, go on to earn steady employment, and have
Not go to
reduced
prison.
likelihood of, yeah, exactly, law enforcement. Whereas boys are more sensitive. They're more sensitive to those early environmental inputs of having constraints and boundaries, and having a role model and a male figure, someone around who can contain that energy and channel it toward more productive ends. Um, and I think this is like an overlooked potential contributor to what we're seeing with sort of mental health difficulties with young people. I mean, I know a lot of people I respect and admire, who focus a lot on smartphones and social media and all these technological changes, which I have zero doubt that those play a huge role. But I do wonder, now that we've had kind of 2 to 3 generations of kids being raised in unmarried homes, single parents, in varying states of kind of disorder and chaos, um, that this also may contribute to mental health difficulties as well. Because now we have kids who, like young adults now, who were raised by parents who themselves were raised by single parents. And so, when single parenthood started to skyrocket in the late 1960s and 1970s, a stat that I often cite is that in 1960 in the US, um, 95% of children were raised by both of their birth parents, regardless of social class. Um, and this started to spike upward across the board, actually, across social classes. Rich and poor started to get divorced and have children out of wedlock in the 1970s. But by the 1980s, the upper class had reverted more or less back to their baseline. It's as if they sort of recognized that what they were doing, having kids out of wedlock and so on, may not have actually been the best thing. And so they
The
learned and
experiment
then went
failed.
back. Exactly. And so they themselves started to live by these old conventional norms, but for lower classes, people without as much money and education and resources and so on, their families fell apart and just never recovered, and they continued to deteriorate. Um, and so it's one thing if you were raised by 2 married parents, say you're a kid in the 1970s or the 1980s, and your parents were married, but then you decide to have a kid on your own or out of wedlock, or you get divorced or whatever. But you still have that template in your mind of like what marriage looks like, what family stability looks like. And so you still have that as you raise your own kids, you still have that example in your mind. But now when those kids grow up, all they have in their mind is their own single mom, then they have a kid out of wedlock, and they don't have that template in their mind for what family stability and security looks like. And so now we've had a couple of generations of this, and I do wonder if, like, over time, this is contributing to feelings of anxiety and uncertainty and hopelessness for the future and all those things, because there's a ton of research in developmental psychology that, especially the first 5 to 7 years of a child's life, those are critical in terms of how they think about attachment, relationship formation, self-image, their general sort of disposition and outlook towards the future, how optimistic versus pessimistic they are. And it makes a difference if you're raised by a single parent versus two parents. It makes a huge difference as far as like how close you feel, um, and it's just math that if you have one parent and they're working, or their attention will be spread very thin, versus if you have two, suddenly you're much more likely to be attached to the parents, and they have more time and more resources and attention to dedicate to you when you're growing up.
Speaking of those early periods where you're developing your attachment and you're like becoming an emotional being and understanding how you're going to operate, something we didn't speak about last time and I learned about you through Troubled was that period of time where you effectively shut yourself off emotionally from reacting
Mm.
as a protection mechanism. And it makes total sense when you read it, but I wonder how you reflect on that period now.
Um, now I understand it. Like a lot of these things that we do in the moment, they're adaptive, they're ways to cope, they're ways to get through difficult periods. But yeah, I mean, in hindsight, as I look back, it is, it's difficult to write those chapters. For me, it was hard to reconnect with the feelings that I had from that time of, living through all the foster homes and living through, separations and divorces and financial catastrophes and so on and so forth, sort of living in so much disrepair and disarray that, in order to get through, you do have to adopt a kind of stoic, unfeeling attitude to forge ahead. But, uh, very few people, I think, could live through that without paying some kind of cost later. And I did. And, I'm glad I saw treatment. I was in rehab. I had to do a lot of inner work to get through all of that. And, there are a lot of people who go through similar experiences, and they never do. And they don't even necessarily recognize why they're behaving the way that they do. Um, and a lot of it does stem back to those early life experiences.
There's quite a trite phrase, Rob:
Mhm.
hurt people. And it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is
And
there's definitely a connection there. Yeah.
and when I was reading the book, and I will say it's probably the most emotional I've been reading a book in the last few years that I can remember, because there were so many undulations in your story, because I felt there were times where it felt like, oh, the corner's being turned and the support network is now being there. And there was that period in your, I don't know, I think you were 8 or 9 when you were adopted by your first adoptive family and mum and dad were together. But then when the parents got divorced, your adoptive dad cut you off in order to hurt,
Mm.
hurt your adoptive mum. And at that moment, I was like, my heart sank. I was like, I just don't understand why somebody would do that to someone. And I guess, like I say, like I can understand how hurtful that period would have been for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at that point, yeah, I was 9 years old, and yeah, after never knowing my birth father and all the foster homes, and then being adopted and then having a dad and then losing contact with him, it was just, you know, like it was really devastating, especially to a 9-year-old kid where, I did think that things were going to be different, and I thought that I had an intact family, and I hadn't. Yeah, even to this day, when I think back, like when I see a 9-year-old kid now, I'm like, "Dad, like that's how old I was when all that stuff happened." Um, it's hard to like imagine that a fully grown man could do something like that. But it was hard to write that and to reconnect with it. But I wanted to be as honest as I could with these stories, and to convey that a lot of kids, like a lot of kids, a lot of boys, girls too, are in situations where they lose contact with their dad, where their dad abandons them, or uh, um,
They can be caught in the
has a
crossfire
kind of
between mum and
sliding.
dad.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of kind of dysfunction and instability in a lot of families like that, and adults will use kids as pawns or as instruments to inflict revenge on their former partner, and it's really ugly. And yeah, yeah, but it was important for me to tell that story, of course.
I know we said that education isn't the best measure, but funnily enough, your academic performance picked up when you were with mum and dad, and then
Hmm.
you started to rebel again after after your adoptive dad left. And if that isn't a case in point, because you're the same person throughout all that time, but you just happen to be in a slightly different circumstance.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like people think that especially people who read some books about behavioral genetics and people who focus on this question of nature versus nurture, and they lean very heavily into nature. Not everyone, but some people do. And so they read my story and they're like, oh, well, it's clear you were smart and you were going to be smart about. And it's like, you know if you want to be academically successful, being smart is necessary but not sufficient. You can have a kid with kind of raw talent, but if it's not channeled in the right way, if they don't have good role models and mentors around them to encourage that raw ability and channel it in the right direction, like it's to me, it's almost like having a impressive athletic ability. You could be like a really fit, really like naturally athletic person, but if there's no one around you to introduce you to a sport and to encourage you and to say, hey, you need to go to practice instead of smoking weed and screwing around with your friends, that you're never going to learn the depth of that person's athletic ability. And it's the same thing, right? It's necessary but not sufficient. And so for me, yeah, my academic performance waxed and waned depending on how much structure and stability was in my life and how much adult oversight there was. If there were people checking in on me, because like no one wants to do homework. I mean, there are a few sort of really odd kids who do enjoy that kind of thing, but most people don't, and I didn't. And when my mom and dad or whoever else was around me and there was stability at home and someone was saying, hey, are you doing homework, are you doing this, and I would do it. But if there wasn't, I just I just wouldn't do it. I was, it's boring, it's uninteresting, it's much more fun to go on misadventures with your friends. And so that's what I would do. And by the time I graduated from high school, I barely passed high school. I think I had like a C minus average, essentially, just barely did enough to scrape by. And that was the kind of student I was. I just was not by the high school years, the last sort of 4 years, I was just completely unfocused. And yeah, it took me a long time to sort of redirect my concentration back towards school.
I remember in those later high school years, your mum and Shelley moved away, so you were even more like unmoored than ever before in terms of a support network. So you can understand why you were probably
Hmm.
acting out more in that stage than at any other time.
Yeah, there were a lot of forces there. That chapter where I moved out when I was 16, my final year of high school, moved in with my friend and his dad and brother. And that was the only friend I had who was raised by a single dad. A lot of my friends were raised by single moms. He was raised by a single dad. His dad had been married and divorced 5 times. His own life was very sort of chaotic. But I moved in with them because there was a lot of drama and financial catastrophes and all kinds of things happening in my between my mom and her partner Shelley. And yeah, I mean, his dad was on the road working all the time. So you essentially had me and my friend, two 17-year-old boys, and his brother who was 16. And like, you leave three teenage boys home alone. Like, of course, there was a lot of close calls, a lot of drinking and driving, a lot of, violence and vandalism and stupidity. And yeah, you're right. I think, it was there was multiple factors there, but one was just because of the age, right? Like naturally, 17-year-old boys tend to be not very bright. Um, the lack of oversight in the home, no adults present. and the fact that my mom and Shelly had split up and they were, a 3-hour drive, 4-hour drive away, that I really just felt sort of unmoored from everything and had this complete freedom. And it's so funny because when I look back at that time, even though I'm writing these stories and clearly there's something going on inside of me, I still, remember that period as like mostly positive, despite despite all the stuff that had happened, because I was uh, in a position where I felt like I had more control over my life than I did before. And then by the time I got to the military, I felt much better. But that was the first time where I felt like I'm responsible for myself and I don't have to rely on anyone else.
One of the phrases I wrote down, Rob, was you had a ton of negative liberty. And that
Hmm.
hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, you actually had like the run of the place to some extent, and you just did your thing, you enjoyed yourself, and like you went into some of the chaotic behaviors that happen in working class neighborhoods where there's high unemployment, easy access to drink, drugs, and you were someone that was surrounded by that. So of course there was times when you ended up partaking in it, and you had a number of kind of those kind of closer calls, which I think if you look at your trajectory, it would surprise people if it had gone the wrong way because of what you had on offer.
Yeah, right. I mean, it was, yeah, it would, all of the kinds of vices and addictions and everything. I mean, it was all around. I mean, this was the mid 2000s, mid late 2000s, but it was very easy to get booze. It was very easy to get weed and prescription pills and all this stuff. And yeah, we were still underage. And so there was still a bit of friction. Like we couldn't just go to the store to get beer, but it wasn't that hard to find someone who could supply it. And so, yeah, we were just, finding different ways to get high or to escape from ourselves or, ditch class and, behave in kind of reckless ways. And yeah, I mean, there were times where like drinking and driving, like it doesn't matter how smart or, like experienced you are. Like if you're drunk behind the wheel on the freeway, um, you can die. And it was just through, sheer luck that none of us did. But I knew kid. There was a girl I knew who had died drinking and driving in my high school, and so that was something that was a very clear possibility that we knew it was a possibility. Like I knew this girl, and she tried, it, and we still did it anyway. You know, like that's kind of the mind of a teenage boy is like
It's that whole young
it
male
wouldn't happen
syndrome,
to
which you
me.
write really well
You know,
about.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like this kind of bravado. It's like that yeah. She can't handle her. She couldn't handle being drunk while she drunk, but I could do it. And yeah, it was just through luck. But yeah, the young male syndrome. I write about that. This concept in psychology, and it's I know some people quibble with the terminology, but it's just a shorthand way, young male syndrome, of communicating the fact that regardless of the society, time and place, the culture, what have you, if you look at who is the most likely to partake in risk-taking behavior, whether it's fist fights or drinking and driving or violence or even things like extreme sports, skateboarding, skydiving, anything that could potentially lead to physical disfigurement or death, tends to be males in their late teens and early 20s. Um, and some societies manage to contain it and channel it and find ways to deal with it. And if you look at poor and working class communities in the US and in the UK, that young male syndrome bubbles up and then it just sort of gets channeled into drug use and violence and driving recklessly and um, yeah, in less productive ways.
No doubt about it. And even like close brushes with like road rage incidents. And if I look at the Rob Henderson that we see on X and we speak to on podcasts, like it's hard to picture like the angry, like slightly reckless young man that you were.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I'm older now, that I'm in my 30s now. So, naturally, that's one of the things about the young male syndrome. And some criminologists, they talk about the age crime curve that, the overwhelming majority of violent crimes and homicides are committed by, again, like young males around age 19, 20 years old. But even for this population, if you track them into their 30s, they almost never, partake in those kinds of violent crimes again. So everyone, even the most sort of violent and impulsive people, your
They
testosterone levels
mellow.
decline. Yeah, you just kind of calm down with age. And so for me, that happened. But I can still feel it on occasion. But I spent those years. In the chapter where I write about the young male syndrome, I'm speaking about my experiences in the military. I left when I was 17 and enlisted. I was still underage. I had to have my adoptive mom sign a was essentially a permission slip for me to join because I was technically still a child legally. And I spent 17 to 25 in the Air Force, 8 years, which is a long time anyway, but 8 years in the military is a really long time. And so, I spent those years, the kind of young male syndrome years, in an environment that taught me a lot. I was in this sort of rigid hierarchical system. And so by the time I got out, even if I hadn't joined, you're just a different person at 25 compared to 17 anyway. But for me, you spend 8 years in that environment, you will come out very different. And so, yeah, with time and so on, you gradually um, settle and become less impulsive, less angry, all those kinds of things. But it took a while. It takes a long time, I think, to mature and develop when you grow up the way that I did. I mean, I didn't set foot on a university campus until I was 25. I mean, that's how long it took me to kind of get my bearings in order. People have asked me, you were clearly smart when you were 17. They've asked me, what if you had gone to college right out of high school? What if somehow you had managed? And I said, I probably would have failed out. Um, I was not, even if sort of intellectually or academically, I had that potential in me to go to a good university. In terms of my attitude and disposition and maturity, like, there's no way. I would have had issues with authority, and I had it in the military. That's the thing. Like, I had all of that stuff, but because it was such a suffocating environment where the punishments were so severe and the consequences were so well known, I couldn't actually act out. Like, I knew that there are like very swift physical punishments that are very unpleasant, and so I couldn't indulge in that impulsivity.
You spoke really highly last time we were together about the structure within the Air Force that really
Mm.
didn't leave wiggle room for you to rebel in the way that you might be inclined to during those 8 years. And by the time you came out, you had a lot more discipline, a lot more structure. You'd worked on yourself. So, of course, you were more likely to be a success at university, which I think is a really important reflection for people because, as you say, you could have the same academic gifts at 17 as you had at 25, but you were much more likely to succeed based on the lifestyle that you'd lived up until that point for 8 years within the forces.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, people talk about elite universities recruiting, like going making more of an effort to get kids from poor and working class areas who have high academic potential. Um, but the thing is, like, there were schools that tried this. Like, Harvard and Yale attempted to go into like inner city schools and high schools and communities in like mostly Black and Hispanic areas in the U.S. in the 80s and the 90s, and they managed to get some of these kids on campus. But a lot of them had severe behavioral issues. Like, yes, on paper they were smart and they got good grades, but when you remove them from home, when you put them in this new environment, and you have all these expectations and demands and so on, it can be very hard to adjust and adapt to that. And it would have been the same for me. Like, if you stuck me on the campus of Yale at 17, like, I don't know what I would have done. But yeah, because I had that 8 year period of maturation and frontal lobe development, and being equipped with all of the tools for how to be an adult, by the time I was 25, I was ready. But again, it took, like, I needed all eight of those years. I mean, I did two 4 year enlistments, Colin. So I was 17, and then I signed up for 4 years, and then I was 21. And as my enlistment was winding down, I knew kind of instinctively that even at 21, I wasn't fully ready to be in the outside world without the confines and the boundaries of the environment the Air Force supplied for me. And so I signed up for four more, and then that was enough. I think that 8 year process was exactly what I needed, even if at the time I didn't like it. It's funny. I tell the story in the book about how one of my friends went to prison, and he was sentenced to 18 months. He served 12, and I visited him shortly after he got out of prison. And I had been in the military now for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And I asked him what prison was like, and he asked me what the military was like. And we both kind of gave the same answers. Like, we were both kind of like, you wake up early and you make your bed and you speak to this person and you go here and here's who you report to, and talking about, and it was like, yeah, it's very similar. Like the first like year or so of military life is like the training process is like a prison like existence. And the military has its hierarchy and its rank structure, and prison has its own kind of pecking order and system like that too. And we both came to this conclusion where at first we both hated the experience. We both went from an environment of total freedom to this very suffocating, very restrictive, rigid environment. And we both hated it. But then as the months went by, we started to appreciate it. And we both started to say, like, it's actually nice to be in an environment of predictability where you know where you're going to sleep and where you're going to wake up and who to report to and what you're responsible for and who's responsible for other things. And my friend disclosed to me that he liked it so much he wished he could go back, and he actually did. And it was actually that time where I was thinking about reenlisting, and eventually I did too, because the whole point there was about how these two young guys, me and my friend, had unlimited freedom, negative liberty, as I describe it later in the book, and we experienced a taste of sort of boundaries and constraints, and we found like that there was something appealing about it, even if at first we kind of rebelled against it internally.
It's a little suffocating, but with that structure comes an element of purpose and fulfillment and ability to see progress. And if you look at what you went on to do, it makes total sense. Appreciate not quite the same for, I think it was it Tyler that went to jail, or one of your friends? I remember some of the names, and
yeah, it was Tyler, and then my other friend Christian.
Yeah, but what an interesting period. And I know when you went to university, this was when you really started to work on that concept of luxury beliefs and some of your understandings and insights around social class. And I loved how much you'd written about it previously, but the way that you pull it together in the book, I really think people get an insight as to why you are so pro family unit now, coming from the background you come from, but also explaining explaining the importance of it across the board. And it's interesting that you almost end up conservative with a small c based on wanting values like that. And I mentioned before we record, I'm recording this while I'm out in Dubai, and I recorded with Zubi last week. And I know you've spoken to Zubi at length, and he was like really speaking powerfully about the benefits of the family and how society has become debased and unmoored based on some of the behaviors we've implemented. And your tie-in with luxury beliefs and talking about how some of the elites are almost encouraging these different marriage structures or different relationship structures and different family structures, and yet live in the kind of structures that are optimal, is it's laughable, really.
Yeah. I mean, the people who wield the most influence exert the most kind of power, and in policy and in culture, society at large. The elites, they they have the highest rates of marriage, and they have they live, if you look at their private lives, they work very hard, they get married, they prioritize education and family and structure and stability and discipline and punctuality and all those kinds of things. But then their public position is that, these things are unimportant, or at the very least, they refuse to cast any kind of judgment on anyone. They will accept and validate and affirm behaviors from other people that they would never accept for themselves or their own children. Acting out, disruption, crime, drug use, having children out of wedlock. I mean, like there's if you ask college educated people, is it okay to have a child out of wedlock, if you ask them in the abstract, they would say, oh yeah, that's fine. And then if you ask them, well, would you ever do so, the vast majority would say no way. And it's like, okay, if you ask them, well, what if your son or daughter had a child and they were unmarried, they would not like that very much. And so they have one set of standards and norms that predictably lead to success, or at least the avoidance of catastrophic outcomes. But then publicly, their stance is, you shouldn't do this. And they used to uphold these views. I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to get people to think about is that we almost have this reversal from the kind of elite hypocrisy that we used to have. So the old form of elite hypocrisy was something like the John F. Kennedy model, where JFK publicly presented himself to the American public as a good husband, a good father, a family man, someone who, was living by these conventional values. But then privately, he was philanderer and he wasn't such a good father and good husband. Um, and so, he presented one face to the public and behaved a different way privately. I think that's preferable to what we have now, which is we have elites who privately actually behave pretty well, where they are getting married, where they are working hard, where they are, prioritizing their family and their kids and their needs and so on. But then publicly, they're either adopting a stance of complete non-judgmentalism, or the opposite, where they're saying, "Oh, actually, we need to move beyond marriage and beyond the family, or if you want to be in an open marriage, that can be fun for you," or
It's an
you know,
outdated concept. It's
yeah,
patriarchal. It doesn't work. And one of my favorite
yeah.
stories that you told the last time we spoke was around the young lady that said that she was not fussed about marriage, didn't think it was important. But of course, and it was an outdated institution. But of course, she came from a married family, and her expectation was that, of course, she indeed would be married too. And a phrase that
Mm,
always speaks to me in many different areas of life, in particular in this one, is know them by their deeds, not their words. And it's very easy to see somebody's public facing image and rhetoric. But ultimately, if you look at somebody's habits and their behaviors, you quite quickly understand who they really are.
yeah, yeah, and that's important to know that you know words can be very deceptive. And so if you look at the opinions and the attitudes of the elites, something like 75% of college educated Americans say that um, it doesn't matter if a child is raised by two married parents or not. The vast majority say, "Oh, it's not that important. It's unimportant." Um, but then if you look at what they do, only 90% of college educated people are married when they have children. And so they live by one standard, get married and then have kids. But then publicly, their position is, "Oh, it doesn't matter. It's not, there are different ways to have a family. They're all the same. It's, you do you, that kind of thing." And I go through a bunch of statistics like this in the book around legalization of hard drugs and all kinds of other things. And, like I think that for a lot of them, their hearts are probably in the right place. Like they don't want to wag their finger, they don't want to interfere with people's lives and so on. But I just think it's so funny when they choose to adopt this non-judgmental stance, and when they are willing to say that some forms of behavior and attitudes are better than others. So something like recycling, for example, college-educated, affluent people are more than happy to wag their finger at people who don't recycle, who don't care about the environment, who aren't prioritizing the needs of the atmosphere and the climate and so on. Um, so now they're more willing to judge and condemn you for not recycling than they are to judge and condemn an absentee father, for example.
The priorities are so out of whack. And I actually brought up your concept of luxury beliefs and how the elites have some highfalutin ideas that have costs that are more heavily inflicted on the poor when I was talking about are you familiar with like the low emission zones and ultra low emission zones that have been implemented in some city centres where particular vehicles are like fined or banned from going in? And most of the vehicles are older vehicles, or if they're diesel. And remember when diesel was actually encouraged, which is funny to watch how people flip flopped
Yeah.
over that. But in Glasgow city centre, where I'm from, Rob, the council have dispensations for some of their vehicles. So if you're like a council official or something like that and you're driving in and out, that's fine. But if you're like an older taxi or a work van that's needed to go into the city centre, then you
Hmm.
are fined or unable to go in whatsoever. And that for me is the ultimate luxury belief. Like, yes, we're trying to fight carbon emissions, but actually pay us money to do it. Or if you're wealthy enough to buy an electric car or upgrade your van to something that's more recent, then you're allowed in to come and play with the big boys. And I find it so distasteful.
Yeah, I mean, it's an attitude that reveals this sort of disconnect between elites and the masses, between, the highly formally educated and the working class. And, you see this with so many other, I mean, I saw this survey from Rasmussen in the US that they compared the attitudes of the elites to ordinary voters. And, they defined elites as people who had, um, postgraduate degrees who earned $150,000 or more a year, which is not a terrible definition of elites if you have to give it a definition. And they found that something like 80% of them agreed that meat and electricity should be strictly rationed to battle climate change. And in contrast, only 16% of ordinary voters agreed with this. So it's like, the people who are at the top of society, the vast majority of them think, yeah, we should control how much meat you eat and how much gas you use and electricity and so on. And the masses are like, ordinary people are like, that's a crazy idea, and they disagree with it. But there's this sort of widening divergence between, what I call the luxury belief class, who think that they're doing the right thing. Most of them, at least think they're doing the right thing. And, in the end, what they do is end up sort of inflicting costs and inconveniences and harm on those who are lower down the socioeconomic spectrum.
Inflicting cost is the perfect term, and that's why I love what you do, Rob. You're able to so clearly convey what those challenges are, and I think the climate alarmism, which is a term that I've adopted in the last 12 months, is one of the most blatant examples of it, and I've really rallied against it. And I
Mm.
think it's been so deeply ingrained in the education system that the world's on fire and global warming is all the fault of these rich people in the West, or all of us in the West, and we all need to pull together to fight it. And you're thinking, oh, well, I'm actually not sure that's the case. But in order to tackle it, we're bankrupting ourselves and really hurting people at the lowest possible like hardest possible time in their pocket, with things like energy bills are just absolutely crazy in the UK. And 25% of all bills is a green levy, which puts money towards wind and solar. And you're thinking, okay, well, some people can't afford that extra 25% right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just this, I had this professor in college who liked to say that common sense is like air. The higher you go, the thinner it gets. And when you've spent your whole life immersed in material comfort and around highly educated people, you've never actually worked a job where, you're on your feet all day and where you're not getting paid much money and you have to clock in and out and you have, commitments and obligations and difficulty paying your bills. And, um, then you start to speak to other people who have grown up the same way you did, and you sort of form this misguided consensus that maybe sounds really good on paper and it makes you all feel pleased with yourselves. You all pat yourself on the back, um, without really having a conversation with someone who isn't in that rarefied segment of society, or looking at survey data to see whether ordinary people would support it, or how it would affect their lives. You just, oh, well, we know best because we went to these expensive universities and we set policy, and that somehow that's is enough for you to think that everything you do is right, is just completely foolish. I think. I mean, I'm just amazed. Like, we are sort of hardening along class lines, um, and so I think this does, to some extent, explain, so much of what we're seeing in politics, this sort of divergence between elites and everyone else, and like populist movements and political disarray and everything. It's just,
It's
if elites would
pushback.
just stop talking to each other and start talking to everyone else, that I think, yeah, a lot of this could be sort of mitigated.
Completely agree, Rob. And I find it interesting that independent media, I think, has been a really positive force for doing that. And I look at somebody like yourself who started the Twitter account, started the Substack, has written this fantastic book, and has just kind of pushed it out there. And of course, it's being published by the mainstream, but it's been driven by your popularity online
Yeah.
and your story and your writing ability, which you've proved away from the mainstream. And it's had a really positive impact for you to be allowed to be platformed across so many different podcasts that I love seeing, and all the different people you've been interviewed by in the last few months and weeks. I'm like, oh, I love all these guys and I love all these different podcasts. And I'm like, it's great to see your message out there as well. But the interesting thing that I noticed was that you haven't been able to do a physical book tour. And I found that a surprise. And I wonder if that's pushed back against some of the ideas that you're putting out there from the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, that came as a surprise to me. Last year, my my agent and my publicist, and me, we all sat down and thought, okay, should we do a book tour? And we thought, okay, we'll start small. We'll start maybe in New York, San Francisco, maybe LA, and see what kind of interest there is. We'll sort of gauge response, and then if it picks up, maybe we'll expand it later. But so we contacted a lot of the big independent bookstores in New York and San Francisco, and found that none of them were interested in hosting a book event for me, which was, I thought that was surprising. I mean, for a lot of reasons. One was because I thought I was kind of I would have been a good kind of author for that kind of venue because, there are kind of, there are people who write memoirs, people like Britney Spears. I know her memoir just came out, or someone like Prince Harry, right? Like Prince Harry isn't going to host a book event at a bookstore. Britney Spears isn't going to do that. But I would, I'm kind of like a mid-tier author. I could bring in whatever, a few dozen people, and they'll buy some books and buy some coffee and mill around. And, it would be like it would have been a good venue. Um, for someone like me, this kind of mid-tier author. But none of them were interested in hosting me. And of course, they're never going to provide a reason for why. But I strongly suspect it's because, my message is unwelcome. It makes people feel uncomfortable. For so long, we've been so focused on, education as the be all, upward mobility. And I challenge that claim. I challenge the luxury beliefs around family, around so many other social policies and ideas, defunding the police. I, point out the serious flaws in that idea. And, and then in addition, I think that, some of the um, endorsements that I received also made some people upset. People who run kind of fancy upscale independent bookstores, if they see, like, Jordan Peterson blurb my book, if they see his name on my cover and says nice things about my book, then obviously this book must be problematic or something. And so and then I also think there may be a kind of class element here too, that there is this discomfort where if someone who you know that does achieve upward mobility and then questions some of the beliefs around it, and unchallenged assumptions around it, that also makes people uncomfortable. If whatever, if, like, my mom or my dad or someone was someone who was high up in a legacy media outlet, or was an influential person or something. But my message was the same. So even if I had written more or less it couldn't be the exact same book, but a book with the same message. But whatever, like my mom or my dad was like, whatever, the like an editor at
Integrated into
some
the
fancy
system,
store.
yeah.
Right. Then I think these stores would have had me. But I don't have that, right? I'm kind of an outsider to this world, outsider to the publishing world, the literary industry, and so on. And so, um, there was no way for me to pull strings or connections or whatever. And so, we ended up doing some kind of makeshift events in other venues, and it ended up being fine. But yeah, it was just a shock to me because I grew up, loving bookstores. I like bookstores. I think they're great. I still go to them, despite recent events. But it was just sad to me that there is this sort of closed-mindedness around my book and its message. Again, despite it being published by a mainstream publishing house, and you know, and I personally, I don't think the book is actually that provocative or controversial. It was just reviewed in The Economist, and the reviewer said, like, the book is basically just full of common sense, and it's
Yeah,
like it's
and
nice. Yeah.
one of the things you shared in your story today on Instagram was how closely it aligns with many of the views of Middle America, and you are like a voice of reason for the people. And I would completely agree with that sentiment. And in terms of the book itself, like, one of the things that I've really improved for 2024 so far has been my reading habit before I go to bed again. And your
Mm,
book was a big part of that. I absolutely flew through it because I was really looking forward to reading it each night before bed, to the extent that I was pushing my bedtime back a little bit, Rob.
mm,
But I
mm,
really, really, really was like engrossed in it. One, from a story perspective, because that whole, as I said, facts tell, stories sell piece, but also the like tangible insights off the back of it in terms of what it might mean for society moving forward. And I'm delighted to have this conversation with you again, and really put that message out there, and you bring it across in such a good way, Rob.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, it's funny, I spend 4 or 5 years writing the book, and then I hear people say, they read it in like 4 or 5 sittings. And I'm like, so on the one hand, it's nice. It's nice that people are so engrossed in the book that they're finishing it. But then the other, I'm like, man, it's just like this massive mismatch. What I guess this is true for everything, right? Like people spend, years and years making any interesting product or piece of art or what have you. And then, it just takes a lot less time to sort of consume it. And yeah, I've been really pleased, honestly, with that was my one of my concerns is like, will people connect with this book? Um, because not that many people go through foster care. Not that many people have lived through that level of tumultuous uh environments and so on. And so I worried, like, is this going to be sort of so far out of people's purview that they wouldn't even understand what I'm saying? But I've been really pleased to see that, people do understand like what I'm getting at and can connect with it. And I've been surprised at the number of people who've emailed me and messaged me and so on, who say like, their lives haven't been exactly the same as mine, but they may have had a parent who was an alcoholic, or they may have had some family tragedy or financial catastrophes or something in their life that allowed them to connect with the point that I was making in the book.
Yeah, I come from an extremely stable family background, and for that, I'm very grateful to my mum and dad for that. But I connected deeply with what you were talking about and was moved, like I said, throughout different periods of your story, and like smiling as you got those wins and you started to move forward and you started to address some of the challenges towards the end of your military career around alcohol as well and coping mechanisms. I thought it was a fantastic end to end. And Rob, I'm sure we'll get the chance to speak again in the future. But in the meantime, where should people head towards? One, to get involved with your book, and two, to keep in touch with you.
Yeah, if you want to get the book, it's Troubled: A Memoir of Foster Care, Family, and Social Class, and you can get that, wherever books are sold. And follow me on X at Rob K. Henderson and Substack, robkhenderson.com.
That'll be linked in the show notes. Thank you, Rob, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very